Alright, so I'm doing a quick video because someone had said that HDR off made them get better spotting, and they had a similar system to mine. So I went through and I redid the NVIDIA control panel a little bit. Um, Take a look here. If you can't read it, I'm going to go real fast. Off, app, off, on. Now, gamma correction, if you turn that off, I noticed that the sun and the lighting in the game became very washed, very bright, out of control. It was just not good. So you test it on and off, see what you think. Application controlled, transparency off, off, all off, off. Fixed, off, auto, NVIDIA, and then preferred maximum performance, application controlled. Now here's one that if you turn on the texture anti-sampling and you're using quality or less, it does help a little bit with FPS, and it makes it easier on. I think what it's doing is that the distance items it's not trying to sharpen them so much. So I noticed a lot of the squiggly lines went away in the distance. I've played with all of them. High quality, if you're using that, you are going to get a little bit better visuals, but I recommend at least a 3090 or better to be running any of that kind of high setting. If you're doing that, then you won't need any of the others. But you're better off probably just going quality and then messing with the sampling to see if that cleans up the image for you. So if you're not able to get the image to clean up, that's one way to play with it, and that's one to test. So currently using performance, it seems fine. Actually, I'm going to switch it to high just because I want to try that later. But I had tried high. If you're an older system or any system at all and you want to get pretty good performance right out the bat, start with high performance, walk it up from there. So I highly recommend that. The texture linear optimization. Um, when it's off, the buildings will appear very clear in the distance. They will have their colors, textures. They'll probably sparkle more. With them on, all the distant buildings, before you get within visual range, which would be about a grid to 2 grids, basically the grid they start rendering pretty strong. Um, Depending on your in-game settings, it turns all the buildings into basically a matte black in the distance. I've noticed they still have structure, and you can still identify the buildings, but they're muted color. There's no color variation to it, which is pretty traditional. I mean, if you've flown over, flyover country, you see a lot of buildings, and there's a reason, they'll throw certain colors on them. All right, so that's one that you definitely would. It helps FPS tremendously because computers not having to render those buildings in the distance, yet you still know the city's there. And really, you should be focusing on the dogfight and looking around trying to spot. This is all about spotting, guys. Okay, and smoothness. Threaded optimization. I've tried it on, off, auto. Off and auto, I get a lot of screen freezes. With it, it's just set to on. It seems to limit the times when the computer game and the VR need to process primarily ground target stuff. When you get down low and all the trees and buildings are rendering high city areas, you see a lot of hit to the CPU. You can see this when you go into your expert settings and you watch the advanced mode. You'll see your VRM RAM is only peaking, usually the highest I've seen it peak is 56% of my RAM. But I've seen the CPU pre-rendering go, um, plus 5, plus 6 when you get down there, and that's milliseconds. So that's like adding plus 6 lag in a concept to the time load. And it really doesn't matter in the game because of the way the handshakes work, per se. Um, is they're definitely it's trying to balance all of that out, and if you're in the US or a decent ping to a server, it's not a big deal. If you were already having ping issues, you already got a lot of other problems there. So last, triple buffer off, vertical sync off, 1. I've tried it with 2. I notice more stuttering now. So definitely try to play around with that. If you're an older system, you probably could do that just because you're going to need to. When I had a 3080, it was just a stutter fest. So you need to see, are you seeing stuttering or is it helping your stuttering? It really comes down to how your GPU and CPU are handling transferring information. That is a type of motion smoothing in a sense. I don't want to say that it is, but it is rendering that one frame, and it adds probably another 0.6 milliseconds to the CPU render time, but it processes more. You'll see that it's processing a larger chunk of data, so that's kind of what it's doing there. Test this again. I need help testing, so if you guys see one of these is better, and when you're testing, I have found that auto caused me to get some lag, preferred native caused me to get some stuttering, so stutter, and the least amount of stuttering when this was on. If you have a slower, older system and you turn your head left or right and you see some stuttering in the cockpit, you're going to need to turn settings down. You're going to need to lower your anti-aliasing. You're going to need to definitely make sure you're using high performance. There's a few things you're going to need to be doing. World scale view, which you can find in Steam and you can find in the openxr toolkit. By increasing that a little bit more, I noticed on some of the aircrafts like the 109s, I usually use about 120. I started going 122. At 122, when I moved my head left and right, not only did it make the cockpit in a nice proportion, it's got rid of some of the stuttering. This is very similar to what they do in head smoothing in the game. I'm going to get into that real quick. You guys, we have head smoothing in the game. I've turned it off. Now, when you turn it off in VR, you're going to notice at 0%, smoothing, that it changes your position in the cockpit. It changes the cockpit positioning and view and how close you are to the cockpit. So head smoothing has a lot to do, I believe, with how much you do not see the dials below, because it physically changes that position. I have all my heads set perfectly in every plane. As soon as I removed the head setting, I was offset, and it changed that positioning. Like it pulled me up closer to the dash, and it was weird. So I got rid of it, reset everything, and I found it better for VR in general. If you're finding massive stuttering, test it either way. See what you think. I have been restricting my VR on the head position, and I've had less issues since I've been doing that. Also, so you can see what you think, but I prefer that just because, especially when I fly in some of the arcade servers like Berdoga Dogfights or something, and your head pops out of the cockpit because they allow the third-person view in there. It's very not fun. So I prefer the immersion side, and I'm only in there to practice shooting, not to be in the arcade. The next one I'll go through. These are my settings for if you have a low system. Now, if your system is really getting hit, this is the size of the buildings are rendering from a distance. So the lower the number, and I know 1024 seems to be the default or whatever it is, or 42 or whatever it is, 1040. This is the base of a HP Reverb G2. This is going to make everything much bigger. As far as the buildings go, they're gonna appear larger as you get closer to them, giving you probably more of a realistic feel when you're diving toward the ground, because the buildings are getting fairly large, and then it becomes more like real life rather than little tiny building, big building. If you're getting hit real hard, I would go with half. So whatever 21, I would just do 2161. So 2160 divided by 2, and just go from there. you know, and that's 180. Yeah, so the 180 and then half of that, you know, so I would take 180 and divide that in half also. And if you, that would be the smallest portion. So 540, I don't even think it'll do it around 540. I was looking on there. I haven't tested that yet. You might have to be like 700, 800 or something like that. I know 850 or 840 worked. I tried it and it made the buildings very diminutive, made all the trees diminutive, made all the detail stuff diminutive. Which I did not quite enjoy as much. So I'm using just the native at 2160 just because it's a little bit smoother. I might go back to the 4320, but if you're having a problem, I recommend if you're using the HP reverb 1080, and then if you're not using the reverbs, whatever your resolution is, look it up. You could just go into your Steam, you'll see the slider bar, and you can see 100%, whatever that 100% number is, if you haven't messed with any of your rendering. But even if you did, just go half of your rendering, okay? That would give you the best results as far as FPS and smoothness if your system's getting hit hard. Now, it's not going to change anything when you're down on the ground. For ground pounders, what this means is you're going to fly over, you're going to see the city and buildings. They're going to look a little bit smaller on the ground from far up, you know, so your distance for altitude is going to be off a little bit, but you have an altimeter, you have all those other things that you normally use anyway to give you the perspective there. But you're going to see FPS bonus. When you dive down and you get within a grid, which is what, 5,000 meters, the buildings will begin to render in. You're going to see the colors and so on, and they get more and more definitive. This, of course, will be offset by these settings. So if you're looking, if you have all, you know, 4090 and you're just doing eye candy, you're going to be at high anyway, and you're not going to want some of this stuff turned on. So anybody with a 4090, please give some reports. I got one, it died. So I got my money back. So I'm not going to buy another NVIDIA card more than likely until they figure that out. It was really disappointing. Far blocks, that's the buildings. I recommend keeping the far blocks on because if I was going to be navigating and flying around, you can keep that on, which lets all the tents, targets, objects, and buildings appear, and the close-up trees are not going to be an issue. This is just buildings and cliffs of Dover. You're going to see the cliffs, those kinds of things. The next, this is just a default. You know, guys, this is only when you're in full screen here. This is your little screen when you're loading the game. And you see that up here. You want that smaller. That's actually recommended by the IL2 team. The IL2 team also recommended the keeping your VR lock HMD restricted. And then that's another one that did. So now we're going to talk about what's the big change, and that's the HDR enabled. I've been using this forever because I think the HDR in combination with SSAO looks the best. The problem is SSAO is a type of super sampling which basically deals with light and shadowing. It does look better in the game with SSAO on. It gets rid of a lot of the issues I have with the sun, glare, in general, a lot of different things. It does add an extreme glare to the water in certain aspects, but it feels like it just kind of clouds or unsharpens the image enough on those aspects of the game, the light and shadow, to be more pleasant to the eye. Problem is, it's a stutter fest. It really kills FPS. It kills. It gives you a really poor experience in the smoothness of moving your head around. It's great looking in the lobby. It's great when you're on the ground looking at the trees. It's great. If I was playing a World War I fighter, I would have SSAO on because you're moving around so slow. I would have the HDR on because I'm moving around so slow. In World War I planes, I would have those two on. But if I was getting a stutter fest, or I just wanted to to have the overall experience, I'd turn them off. And the main reason is with HDR off, the spotting is better. I've tested it. I believe that I'm able to spot 30% better than I would with it on. And a part of that problem, I have to atone that I can't use. I haven't found a workaround to really make it work right. I mean, it's just more, maybe because it's more arcade. I think the HDR makes the planes blend into the ground a little bit better in certain circumstances. And I have had many times where I've had a wingman and they'll call out a target and I cannot see it. And it just sometimes is angle, but I've gone back and forth. I probably will go back to HDR, but because my system does handle it fine and I wasn't having some of the issues other people, but in general, try it. And that's one you test. I think it's going to come down to a preference of what you're willing to deal with in the graphics of the game and playability of the game. So that's one of those. And I think that's why I'm making this main video, is just because of that alone. And I've been doing it for days. I probably put 8 hours of different testing going through to find the best settings to make all of this visible to where I felt it was pretty good. Alright, so I'll post the rest of these settings. The one is distance. Now, you can have the radius around your plane to 4x or normal. At normal, I would say is the best setting for VR. Mainly because it's only rendering the detailed items of trees and buildings within a 1 grid radius of you, pretty much. Everything outside of that is still rendered, as far as if you have the far blocks on, the buildings will show up within the grid side, left, right. You know, it is changing as you go around, but it's reducing the overall amount of rendering you guys are dropping on the CPU to basically put into 2 screens on VR and try to get that all synced up. And remember, it's alternating frames in a sense, guys. So you get that stereo effect. So they're having to sync that offset on 2 screens, so your brain is tricked, and you're asking it to add on miles of trees and buildings for visual effect, to make it look good. When we don't have the technology, I mean, the 4090s are probably going to be able to crush this no problem. I had all this turned on. In fact, I do know they crush it no problem. The problem is that you're going to need one of those. I'm thinking the ATI cards will be able to do this too with all of these turned on. So play with it. Let me know how 2x is probably okay, and you can push it out a little bit further. I mean, I will be extending it, but as far as like if I was going to say, hey, you're getting a lot of stuttering, you want to get the most experience and not give up a ton on the game, turn that down. Okay. Shadows I'll come up to in a minute, but I don't want to forget that, because it has a lot to do with the issues of SSAO and HDR that I noticed earlier with the sun being out of control. It is linked to shadows, and I had no idea. When you turn shadows to 0, you'll notice the first effect is there's a small white stone box or some sort on the right hand side of the hangar. With the shadows off, that box is going to be bright white and shining up like it's illuminated, like it's the sun itself. Shadows 1 to 4 get rid of that problem. It also helps with the overall effect of the sun in a lot of situations. I'm using quality 4 because it seems the newest shadow version, the ultra version, is just as much hit to the CPU rendering and the GPU rendering to the VRAM that I'm seeing than with it at 1. There was a difference of like 0.2 to 0.1 milliseconds difference, so not much, and it's better quality. It looks better. If you have a slower system, start with 1 and go up. I don't recommend 0 anymore, because now that I have a realization that the issues with their overall effects to the environment for lighting and everything else is closely tied to their shadow link, that it is something I don't recommend unless you're really going to down some graphic settings and get the game very arcadey. Then it probably could go off. I don't think I have anything else in there to go over too much. You can under render, guys, and then use the open toolkit to upscale within the goggles. It's in their settings. Go to their website and look at it. That is one way to get a similar, but you're basically doing the same effect as here, and the concept of making things really small, and then stretching it out, which makes the images a little more distorted. They're more cartoony, that kind of thing. The dots probably be a little bit bigger in a lower setting, for sure, because you're blowing the image up a little bit. So that's something you're going to do. In fact, I'm just going to test for 320, and go from there. So those are those. I'm a little tired because I did go and test this a million times. The one thing I am 100% certain is that turning grass down, turning your distance rendering down for that, you could even turn down how far out you see the horizon. Those kinds of things are going to have massive improvements to overall smoothness in the game, and playability. So focus on that first, really, for VR. I recommend that. If you're going to enjoy this the most, you really want the planes to seem like they're just flying around. Give up a little bit on the eye candy until you can get a system that can pump it out, really. That's just the honest truth. So I've gone through those. I think that's about it. I don't think there was any other major settings I'd have to go over. Toolkit, I will be honest, guys, I am lowering down the sharpening under these settings. You're going to notice that if you see in the load screen that the aircraft that you're looking at, I recommend like go in and have like a German plane, like a 109, that's going to have a sharp edges. But any of the planes will do it. If you see the light shimmering around the edges of the sharp angles, start turning down your sharpening until you see those go away. There shouldn't be any of that glistening along the edges. You're over rendering that area, and it's causing artifacting. And it's just happening right on the edges, so it looks like a sun effect, but it's actually artifacting. So crank it down. I've been using 100%. In HDR, it didn't seem that much of a difference. Maybe because HDR is just so over saturated with light and everything else anyway, that you're not noticing as much. It just honestly, it looks like glass reflections in that version with HDR on, so it's not as disturbing. Or maybe you just playing the game for 2 years with that on, I got used to it. But that is a big deal. So the sharpening and it also helps with FPS. If you're not pushing that to 100%, you're going to gain a little bit of FPS, I've noticed. I've tested the NIS. Now, if you have an older system or even a newer system, I recommend testing the NIS now with these settings. Down on the ground, if I'm flying around and if I was just doing ground pounding 24/7 and I was going to be testing it, I would say do a day on the NIS, of ground pounding, and do a day on the FSR and see what you think. Because I personally find that the NIS was smoother on the deck, especially with all of the settings I just went through. And it actually was better by turning down the rendering for the distance, because one of the biggest issues with NIS is that the distant targets, distant objects, the trees and the horizon and the coastlines look like garbage in NIS. But when you turn down the game settings to normal or 2 times, NIS then starts to excel in what it is. And the clarity of the planes up close are phenomenal, I think, in NIS, as equal to the FSR. So between the two, they're great, for that purposes of spotting and gameplay. Honestly, I think my earlier videos, I've always been pushing to get the most amazing visuals in the game and playability, but I was also allowing the game to be not as smooth and playable as it could be, to sacrifice for the eye candy. And I've pretty much, I went and made my changes, and to be honest, I had a 17 kill streak on Combat Box right after I did the changes, guys. I didn't become a better pilot. So if that tells me something, I'm going to stick with this for a while, do a little more testing, and see if that is a big issue. Because there's many a times, and many of us playing VR have said, man, I put the bullet right into the guy I don't understand, and I don't think the graphics were there was some severe lag or something happening there, or something that is not setting to the game, is throwing things off. Um, you could compensate that by shooting, what I call into the future, which is just a lead shot, so they would, you would hit them still. But that's not a long-term success rate there. Especially when I saw the difference, the ability to choose my target, shoot them in the cockpit, and get an instant kill because I aimed the cockpit and I hit the cockpit accurately multiple times. I mean, you can go back and look at my run on Combat Box, and you'll see. You just go into what my previous lives are and see all that. So you can see where my gunnery went up. I saw a massive improvement during that period of time. Each at the end of those, I was looking at it. I went from around 4% to a 10% instantly. So there you go. And it's mainly because I didn't have to throw so many rounds downrange to find where I had to lead that target to. I was point, shoot, click, hit. It was that much of a difference. So I hope this helps, and if you guys have any questions, please leave it in the comments. Again, if you find anything in the testing, like one person made a comment there about the HDR, thank you. It led me to making this video and going down and discovering another way to play VR, or set up for VR for IL2 that I had not tried before. So the other one is still valid. I mean, a lot of people are using it. It works fine. It worked fine for me, I thought. But if you are using the other way and you're willing to give up a little bit, just go in and try it. Now remember, if you do any changes in your control panel, it will reset your start file. If you set your start file to read only and you do changes in your control panel, it will not apply to the startup file. So I recommend just going in, going into your startup, do the changes in the game, and then come back in and just change your detailed res. It'll give you the default, which I think is 1024. I'm not remembering exactly. Don't quote me on it. But I do recommend on the G2s just 1080, just for programming sakes. If your monitor was X by X and you could change the game to be perfectly square to the game's resolution, you're better off. Math is math. It always will be. So I think that's the only one you would have to mess with. I haven't seen the bloom kicking back on and off. If you want to try, like I said, any of the other ones, let us know what your experience was, and definitely, guys, give me some feedback on the head smoothing thing I talked about. All right, thank you.